The morning of June 6, 1944, was a defining moment in history. Yet for Sergeant Curtis Cullen, it started as just another day of fighting on the chaotic and blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. But little did he know, this seemingly ordinary day would set the stage for a mind-blowing invention that would save countless lives. This story, often left out of history books, is the tale of one man's ingenuity and determination to solve an unsolvable problem, using nothing more than scrap metal and sheer willpower. Now, hold on, because what happened next is not only incredible, it could change the way you view war, invention, and the power of human creativity. Stick around until the end. You'll be as amazed as the soldiers who witnessed it firsthand. And before we dive into the story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss out on more thrilling untold stories like this one. Normandy, June 1944. The invasion was supposed to be the turning point. The Allied forces were supposed to surge forward, capturing territory as they marched toward Paris. But there was a problem so insidious, so insurmountable, that it was halting the entire Allied advance. It wasn't German artillery, it wasn't tanks, and it certainly wasn't machine guns. The real issue? The hedgerows, those ancient thick walls of earth, stone, and tangled roots that covered Normandy like a maze. What was supposed to be a mere obstacle for farmers to mark their boundaries had turned into an unforgiving battlefield for American tanks. Imagine this. The Sherman tanks, some of the most advanced vehicles on the battlefield, would drive toward these hedgerows trying to climb over them, but as soon as the tank's belly was exposed, the Germans waiting on the other side would strike. One shot, and the tank would go up in flames, and its crew, if they were lucky, would burn or be crushed to death. The hedgerows had turned the once mighty tanks into sitting ducks. Soldiers died, tanks burned, the advance stalled. It was like a deadlock that no one could break. And for Sergeant Curtis Cullen, watching this tragedy unfold, he knew something had to change. But what? He was no engineer, just a mechanic with a car repair background. But sometimes the people who know how machines work are the ones who figure out how to fix them, even when everyone else gives up. As the days dragged on, he had a simple idea. What if they didn't try to climb over the hedgerows at all? What if the tanks didn't expose their vulnerable bellies? Instead of fighting the barrier, why not simply go through it? After all, hedgerows were earth, stone, and roots. How hard could it be to plow through them with a tank? This idea at first seemed almost ludicrous. It wasn't anything special, just a thought that made sense to him. A mechanic, not an engineer, after all. But that was the moment when something in Cullen clicked. The hedgerows were hard, dense, and impossible to go over without exposing the tanks. But if you could cut through them at ground level, creating a path that kept the tank's armor facing the enemy at all times, now that might just work. It wouldn't be easy. The hedgerows were centuries old, and it wouldn't be a quick fix, but it had to be worth trying. With nothing but scrap metal from the beach's German obstacles, a welding torch, and a determination that only a mechanic who understood machinery could have, Cullen began to sketch out a plan. It was the most basic of ideas. Use the scrap metal to weld massive prongs onto the front of a Sherman tank. He envisioned these prongs as giant steel teeth that would dig into the thick hedgerows, allowing the tank to push forward without exposing its weak underside. But this crazy idea, it wasn't met with open arms. His fellow soldiers thought he was mad, a mechanic on a wild goose chase. They joked about it, calling his drawings crazy plans and rolling their eyes. But Cullen wasn't discouraged. He'd faced that kind of doubt before. Mechanics, after all, were often underestimated. People saw them as hands-on workers, not problem solvers, but Cullen knew differently. Mechanics weren't just fixers. They were creators, innovators who had to understand how things worked, how parts interacted, and how to make them do what they were supposed to do. And so, without waiting for approval from anyone, Cullen went straight to his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison. With a plan that sounded straight out of a mad scientist's playbook, he asked to take a damaged Sherman tank, one that had already been hit but was still operational, and weld the steel prongs to the front of it. The idea was simple. Slam the prongs into the hedgerows, let them dig into the earth, and create a path through which the tank could drive without exposing its vulnerable belly. He didn't expect a warm reception. Captain Morrison listened in stunned silence before speaking, his disbelief evident. "Let me get this straight, Sergeant," he said. "You want to take a tank which has already been hit and weld scrap metal to it and then drive it full speed into a wall of earth and roots. Is that your plan? Without hesitation, Cullen replied, yes, sir. The other tanks are getting blown up because they're trying to climb over the hedgerows. This will keep the armor facing forward, and the Germans won't be able to shoot us. Morrison stood there, staring at him. It was risky. It could fail. But it was also logical. He thought for a moment and then said, "You've got 48 hours. If it works, we'll talk about mass production. If it doesn't, well, we'll both answer to the generals." And just like that, Cullen's plan was approved. Now Cullen needed to act fast. He requisitioned welding equipment and brought in a work crew. He went to the beach where the D-Day landings had taken place, and there, he found a treasure trove of German obstacles, the very things that had been used to stop the Allied landing forces. Among them were the Czech hedgehogs, massive steel structures meant to block tanks and landing craft. These hedgehogs, though designed to stop tanks, were perfect for Cullen's plan. He and his team spent hours cutting them apart, sharpening the steel beams and preparing the prongs. They welded them into place, creating a crude yet powerful tool that could help breach the hedgerows. By dawn on the second day, the modified Sherman was ready. The crew of soldiers stood around, some skeptical, some curious. "Looks like a pig trying to mate with a porcupine," one soldier joked. But Cullen, ever the professional, wasn't bothered by the mockery. He patted the steel prongs affectionately and said, "This pig's about to plow through every hedgerow between here and Berlin." The moment of truth had arrived. With everything on the line, Cullen's team prepared for the test. The Sherman tank, now with its steel prongs attached, charged straight into a thick hedgerow, the very kind that had been killing so many soldiers. The impact was deafening, the entire tank shaking with the force of hitting something that had been standing for centuries. For a moment it looked as though the prongs might snap or the tank might stall, but no. The prongs dug into the earth, creating a path as the tank pushed forward, its belly never once exposed to enemy fire. The soldiers watched in awe as the Sherman tank tore through the thick hedge, emerging victorious on the other side. It was a perfect breach. The tank's crew erupted in cheers, their excitement palpable. The idea had worked. The invention, once a crazy thought in a mechanic's mind, had proven itself in combat. That's when Major Jack Williams walked up to Cullen and asked, "How many of these can you make? And how fast?" Without missing a beat, Cullen replied, "If I get enough welders, we can make 10 a day, maybe more." And just like that, the first steps toward changing the Normandy campaign had been taken. The test had been a success, but it was only the beginning. The real test was yet to come. This invention had the potential to change the tide of the war in Normandy, but it had to be proven under real combat conditions. It wasn't enough to just break through a hedge in a controlled environment. The real challenge was whether this contraption could hold up when enemy fire rained down, when the pressure was on, and when lives were on the line. Captain Morrison wasn't about to let Cullen off the hook that easily. He immediately ordered the creation of more modified tanks, and within days, the so-called Cullen hedge cutter was making its way to the front lines. But it wasn't just about testing one tank anymore. Now they had to make sure this tool could work under the harshest of conditions. The Germans weren't going to make it easy. In the meantime, Sergeant Cullen had become a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He wasn't basking in the glory of his invention. In fact, he was far from it. As he walked among the soldiers, many of them congratulating him, he couldn't shake the feeling that his invention had only solved one problem, and that new challenges were right around the corner. What if this new tool didn't work as expected in a real fight? What if it failed and soldiers paid the price for it? He couldn't ignore the weight on his shoulders, but he wasn't the kind of man to back down from a challenge. He had already risked everything by proposing this outlandish idea, and now it was time to see if it would live up to the expectations. He couldn't afford to doubt himself, not when so many depended on this invention working. The morning of the next mission arrived with a cold drizzle hanging over Normandy. It wasn't the ideal weather for a battle, but there was no turning back now. The modified Sherman, affectionately named Rhinoceros by its crew, rolled out, its steel prongs gleaming through the mist. This was the moment where the concept would either prove itself or fall apart. The target was a German stronghold just 2 miles ahead. Intelligence had reported that a German Panther tank was guarding the position. This wasn't just any tank. The Panther had a 75mm cannon, capable of piercing a Sherman's armor from a distance. The Allies had been stalled for days in this area, unable to breach the defensive line. Now, with the Cullen cutter attached to the Sherman, Cullen and his crew were determined to change the course of this battle. As the tank rumbled forward, the crew members' nerves were on edge. The impact was imminent. They approached the first hedgerow, and the moment of truth was upon them. The Germans had positioned their defenses with expert precision, but they hadn't expected this new tactic. The Sherman surged forward, crashing into the thick hedge. The prongs dug in, and the tank started to power through the barrier. For a moment it looked like the cutter might get stuck, but no. The tank pushed forward, and in seconds it broke through, keeping its front armor facing the enemy. "It's working," shouted one of the crew members over the intercom, excitement filling his voice. But there was no time to celebrate. The enemy was still out there, and every moment counted. The crew pressed on, the tank breaching hedge after hedge with speed and efficiency. With every breach, the infantry followed closely behind, clearing German positions that had once seemed impenetrable. It was working, just as Cullen had imagined. No more exposed bellies, no more easy targets for the Germans. But then came the real test. The Panther tank, positioned just beyond the last hedgerow, was waiting for them. The crew knew that this would be the ultimate challenge. The Panther had the firepower to destroy a Sherman from a distance, and if they didn't act fast, they could be sitting ducks. Cullen's mind raced. It wasn't enough to simply breach the hedgerow. They had to keep moving. The moment they came through the hedge, the Panther would be in range, its turret swinging to track them. But Cullen wasn't afraid. He trusted his design, and he knew that speed was their only advantage now. "Don't stop. Keep going. Full speed ahead," he ordered over the intercom. The Sherman tank surged forward again, its engine roaring louder than ever. The impact with the hedge was deafening, but the tank powered through. As they emerged on the other side, the Panther tank's turret was already turning to face them. It was now or never. The crew fired first. The shot from the Sherman's main gun struck the side of the Panther, its thinner armor giving way to the powerful round. The Panther shuddered as smoke poured from its hatches. The Germans abandoned their tank, realizing they were no match for the Sherman, which had just torn through their defenses. The Allies had succeeded in breaking through the German stronghold. It was a victory, but more importantly, it was proof that the Cullen cutter worked in combat. The impact of the invention was felt almost immediately. Other units across the battlefield began to adopt the same modifications, and soon the Cullen cutter was no longer just a battlefield innovation. It became standard equipment for Sherman tanks. The change was nothing short of revolutionary. The ability to clear hedgerows without exposing the tank's belly was a game-changer. No longer would the Sherman be vulnerable to anti-tank fire when approaching these thick walls of earth and stone. But the story didn't end there. What started as a makeshift solution built in a garage with scrap metal had now become one of the most significant inventions of World War II. By August 1944, the Cullen cutter was being mass-produced. Tanks were rolling off the production lines with the cutter already attached, ready to change the face of warfare. It wasn't just the Allies who noticed the change. German soldiers who had relied on the hedgerows to trap and destroy tanks were now baffled. Reports from German after-action reviews showed confusion. Enemy armor is now passing through hedgerows without exposing vulnerable areas. Unknown how this is being accomplished. They didn't know what hit them. The Germans tried to counter the new tactic by reinforcing hedgerows with mines, anti-tank guns, and even creating fake hedgerows to set traps for the advancing Allies. But none of these tactics worked against the Cullen cutter. The Allies were using the hedgerows against the Germans, forcing them to adapt on the fly. The Cullen cutter proved itself in more than just the Normandy campaign. As the Allies pushed further into France and beyond, the cutters found new applications. They were used to break through urban barricades, push through snowdrifts, and even clear paths for vehicles during river crossings. The cutter's versatility made it one of the most valuable tools on the battlefield. But even as the war moved forward, Cullen couldn't escape the nagging feeling that his invention had brought unintended consequences. His creation had helped to shorten the Normandy campaign, saving countless lives. But it also meant that German soldiers, who might have survived a slower advance, were now being killed in greater numbers as the Allies pushed forward faster. Was his invention a blessing or a curse? As the Allied forces advanced through Europe, the success of the Cullen hedge cutter was undeniable. It was now an essential piece of equipment for Sherman tanks, and its impact on the battlefield was felt everywhere. Tanks that once had to fight against the impossible challenge of hedgerows were now breezing through them, allowing infantry to follow with ease. The speed of the advance was staggering, and the Allies were making progress faster than they could have imagined. Yet in the midst of all this, Sergeant Curtis Cullen couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. He had been thrust into the limelight as the inventor of a groundbreaking tool that had saved countless lives. But for Cullen, the rewards were bittersweet. He had done what needed to be done, but now the reality of what it meant started to settle in. Soldiers were still dying. The war wasn't over, and his invention, though it was helping, couldn't change the fundamental truth of warfare, that it was about life and death, sacrifice and loss. The pressure was mounting, but Cullen had never been the kind of man to shy away from responsibility. He had a job to do, and that was all that mattered. What he hadn't expected was the recognition that came with it. News of his invention spread like wildfire, and soon he found himself giving interviews, speaking at military briefings, and being treated like a hero. He was even nominated for promotions and honors, but the attention made him uncomfortable. He wasn't a hero in his eyes. He was just a mechanic who'd seen a problem and come up with a simple solution. He had never imagined it would turn into something that would change the course of the war. But the reality was clear. He had changed things. His invention had done more than just help push the Allies forward. It had saved lives. It had saved the lives of the soldiers who no longer had to risk death by trying to cross hedgerows. It had saved the lives of the infantry who followed in the wake of those tanks, free from the constant threat of enemy fire. His invention had made it possible for tanks to advance without exposing their most vulnerable parts, and that, in turn, had turned the tide of the Normandy campaign. General Bradley himself had visited Cullen to express his admiration. The general was one of the highest-ranking officers in the Allied forces, and his praise for Cullen's invention meant everything. "What you've done, Sergeant, is nothing short of brilliant," Bradley told him, shaking his hand. "You've solved a problem that had stumped our best engineers, and now you've saved lives and given us a tactical advantage we didn't have before." For the first time in his life, Cullen realized that his work, the small and seemingly insignificant change he had made to a tank, had far-reaching effects. But as the battle continued to rage across Europe, he couldn't help but wonder about the men who had died before this solution was found. How many lives could have been saved if someone had thought of it sooner? Could more have been done? The guilt weighed heavily on him, even as he saw the positive effects of his invention unfolding. But there was no time to dwell on the past. The war was moving forward, and there was work to be done. New challenges were waiting. The Germans, now aware of the new tactic, had begun adapting their defenses, trying to find ways to counter the hedgerow cutter. They attempted to reinforce their hedgerows, place mines along key routes, and set traps for the advancing tanks. But no matter what they tried, they couldn't stop the Allies. The Cullen cutter had already made its mark, and the Germans knew they couldn't afford to let it spread further. Cullen continued to visit tank depots, overseeing the modifications and helping to ensure the new equipment was properly integrated into the tanks. His role was no longer just that of a mechanic. He was now a technical advisor, helping to train other soldiers and pass on his knowledge. Each day more and more tanks rolled out with the Cullen cutter attached. And with each new tank, the Allies gained more ground. The invention had spread beyond just the tanks on the battlefield. The Allies began using the concept in new ways, developing adaptations for urban combat and for situations where tanks had to navigate through obstacles like fallen trees or even snow. The versatility of the hedge cutter amazed everyone. It wasn't just about hedgerows anymore. It was about changing the way tanks interacted with their environment altogether. Soldiers found new and creative ways to use the cutters, each application making the tool even more valuable. But with every success came new challenges. As the Allies moved faster, logistics became a nightmare. Supply lines were stretched thin, and many units found themselves advancing faster than their support could keep up. Ammunition and fuel were in short supply, and it wasn't long before tank crews found themselves in situations where they had to improvise just to keep their tanks running. Cullen, once again, found himself at the center of these discussions, helping to find solutions for the problems created by the success of his invention. He worked alongside logisticians to develop better supply systems, adapting to the rapid pace of the advance. Despite these new issues, the real reward came when the war finally drew to a close. The Normandy campaign, which had once seemed endless, was now over. The Allies had broken through and they were advancing into Germany itself. It was a moment of victory, but for Cullen it was also a moment of reflection. He thought back to the early days of the campaign, to the hedgerows that had stalled them for so long. The cutters had helped them break through, but at what cost? Was it worth it? Had his invention really saved as many lives as it had taken? The war had ended and Cullen returned home to New Jersey in late 1945. His name was well known in military circles, and his invention had become a symbol of American ingenuity. But Cullen wasn't interested in fame or accolades. He returned to his old job as a mechanic, fixing cars and trucks. The war was over, and the only thing that mattered now was rebuilding, fixing things that were broken and moving forward. Though he had saved countless lives during the war, Cullen never spoke much about it. When people asked about his experiences, he would deflect, never truly embracing the title of hero. For him, it was just a job. He had done what needed to be done, and now it was time to move on. He would always remember the soldiers who had died, the men who had never made it out of Normandy, and the ones who had walked alongside him through the battles. But in the end, his focus was on fixing things, not just tanks, but life itself. As the years passed, Curtis Cullen became somewhat of a local legend. The quiet mechanic who had invented something so simple, yet so revolutionary, had gone back to his life after the war, fixing cars in his small garage in New Jersey. Yet the echoes of his ingenuity reverberated far beyond his quiet town. The Cullen hedgerow cutter was a tool that had forever changed the way tanks operated in World War II, and its impact didn't fade with time. In the years following the war, historians and military analysts began to revisit the innovative design that had given the Allies such a crucial edge in Normandy. The hedgerow cutter was featured in books, documentaries, and military training manuals, hailed as one of the unsung tactical innovations of the war. While many other technological advancements during the war were more high-tech or sophisticated, the hedgerow cutter stood out for its simplicity. It was an example of the kind of battlefield innovation that didn't come from a laboratory or a well-funded research project, but from a mechanic who understood the machinery and saw a practical solution to a problem. Despite the recognition, Cullen remained grounded. He never sought the spotlight. He had always been a man of action rather than words. When a young historian named David Carter sought him out for an interview decades after the war, Cullen was initially reluctant. But when Carter explained how significant his invention had been, Cullen was still humble. "I wasn't special," he told the historian. "I was just a guy who knew how machines worked and saw a problem that needed solving. The special part was that the Army gave me a chance to try." For Cullen, the true value of the invention wasn't in the recognition, but in the lives it had saved. His words resonated with Carter, who understood that, in many ways, Cullen's work was more profound than most of the high-tech weaponry that defined the war. "The real lesson," Cullen continued, "was that good ideas can come from anywhere. The Army didn't care who I was. They cared about the idea, and that's how it should be." Yet there was still a part of Cullen that couldn't fully shake the weight of what he had done. Yes, he had solved a major tactical problem and saved countless American lives, but he had also been a part of the machinery of war. His invention had led to faster advances, but those advances meant more battles, more conflict, and more casualties. Every day he moved forward, he couldn't help but think of the soldiers who never made it home. It wasn't just the Germans who had suffered. It was the Americans, too. His invention had been a tool that made killing more efficient. It saved lives, but it also contributed to death. The duality of that truth was something that always lingered in his thoughts. However, as the years passed, Cullen found a sense of peace. The war had ended, and with it, his role in that brutal chapter of history. When asked about his experiences, he would often downplay them, telling people he was just a mechanic who'd fixed some tanks. But those who knew the full story understood just how much more it had been. After the war, his life settled into a rhythm of quiet, uncelebrated work. He remained in the background, unnoticed by the public at large. But for those who took the time to dig deeper, His contribution to history could not be ignored. The hedgerow cutter had changed the war in ways that no one could have predicted, and it had paved the way for other innovations that followed. In 1984, years after the war had ended, the Cullen hedgerow cutter was still being remembered. The tool had become an icon of ingenuity, representing the power of practical problem-solving in the face of impossible challenges. And though it had been decommissioned by then, its legacy remained strong. Military museums across Europe and America proudly displayed the remains of these modified Sherman tanks, complete with the steel prongs that had once made it possible for tanks to move through Normandy's thick hedgerows. Carter's interview with Cullen, published years later, brought renewed attention to his humble genius. He had saved thousands of lives, revolutionized tank warfare, and played a pivotal role in the Allied victory. Yet he remained largely unknown to the general public. Despite this, Carter's book highlighted the importance of not just the tool, but the mindset behind it, a willingness to think outside the box, to create, to innovate, and to find a way to solve a seemingly unsolvable problem. For Cullen, the recognition was bittersweet. He had done what was needed, but as he looked back on the war, he couldn't help but wonder how many more lives could have been saved if his idea had been found sooner. And that guilt stayed with him for the rest of his life. Still, the world around him had changed, and so had he. The man who had once been just a mechanic had become a symbol of American ingenuity, the quiet hero whose simple solution helped reshape the outcome of a war. But as he stood back and watched his invention become a part of history, he understood something even deeper, that it wasn't about the fame or accolades. It was about doing what you could, no matter how big or small, to help make the world better. In the end, it was about solving problems, no matter how impossible they seemed. As the war in Europe came to a close and Curtis Cullen settled into his post-war life, he often thought about the incredible journey his life had taken. The quiet mechanic from New Jersey who had come up with an idea that saved lives, shortened a campaign, and contributed significantly to the Allied victory, had returned to civilian life. But he never truly left the war behind. The memories, the faces of the soldiers saved by his invention, and the weight of what it all meant stayed with him. Curtis returned to his garage in New Jersey, working on cars and trucks, as he had before the war. The hum of engines, the smell of oil, and the familiar rhythm of fixing things was his peace. But there were still moments when people would approach him, asking about the war, asking about the hedgerow cutters. He always deflected, always downplayed his involvement. To him, he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had seen a problem and come up with a solution. He was, however, recognized in his community and by those who had known him from his military service. It was hard for him to reconcile the quiet life he led now with the historical figure he had become. He never sought the accolades, the medals, or the recognition. He simply wanted to be the guy who fixed things, whether that was a broken car or a tank stuck in the mud. The military, however, never forgot him. His invention had been immortalized. The Cullen hedgerow cutter was one of the most successful tactical innovations of the war, and it had saved countless lives by allowing tanks to breach the heavily fortified hedgerows of Normandy without exposing their vulnerable undersides. It had allowed the Allies to push forward faster, saving months of fighting and ultimately helping to end the war sooner. And though the war was long over, his contribution remained significant. General Eisenhower himself had recognized the importance of the hedgerow cutter, calling it one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. In the years that followed, military historians would continue to study his invention, showcasing it as an example of the power of simple, practical engineering to solve complex problems. Cullen, in his later years, was honored with multiple awards, including the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and even a field promotion to technical sergeant. But to him, the recognition wasn't important. What mattered was that the cutter worked. It worked because it was based on common sense. It worked because it was a solution that could be implemented immediately. It worked because when given the chance, someone was willing to listen to an idea, no matter where it came from. As the years passed, Curtis lived a quiet life. He continued to tinker with machines, fix cars, and go about his business. But his role in the war never fully left him. The story of the hedgerow cutter was never far behind. He became a quiet symbol of American ingenuity, a reminder that the greatest ideas can come from the most unexpected places. But his work wasn't just about the cutter. It was about the mindset it represented. It was about recognizing problems and finding practical solutions. It was about the idea that anyone, regardless of background, education, or rank, could change the course of history with a little creativity and the willingness to try something new. The legacy of the hedgerow cutter lived on. It became a symbol not just of military success, but of the power of thinking differently. It was proof that in the face of adversity, the smallest change can sometimes have the greatest impact. And for those who had seen the war firsthand, who had witnessed the destruction, the suffering, and the sacrifices, it was a reminder that even in the darkest times, a single idea could change everything. Curtis Cullen's story may have never made the front pages of history books, but it became an integral part of the larger story of World War II. The war may have been over, but his innovation had left an indelible mark, and that mark, though quiet and unassuming, was one of the most significant contributions to the Allied victory.